Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the founding chair of the Master's Program in Curatorial Practice here at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. And each Wednesday, I host the Curatorial Roundtable, where I invite a distinguished curator or director, or in this case, both, to come and speak about their practice. I'm going to read a short bio for Axel. Axel Wieder is the new director of the Berlin Biennale for Contemporary Art. Previously, he was director of Bergen Kunsthalle, and he's speaking to us from Bergen today. He was also previously director of Index, the Swedish Contemporary Art Foundation in Stockholm, director of programs at the Arnolfini in Bristol, and artistic director of Künstlerhaus Stuttgart. He's been a visiting curator at Ludlow 38, the Goethe Institute in New York, and he was a co-organizer of the exhibition Now and 10 Years Ago at KW Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin. Wieder is known for his focus on the history and theory of exhibitions, architecture, and social space, as well as on questions of political representation. He's taught at Bauhaus University in Weimar and Zurich University of the Arts, and his writings have been featured in publications such as Text zur Kunst and Frieze. And with that, I'll just say quickly that Axel will speak for about 50 minutes. And then at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A button, and you can click on that, write a question or comment, and Axel will reply. In this conversation, we go for about an hour total. And with that, Axel, welcome. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to join the roundtable today. I'm very happy to be here. It's yeah, I assume there are other people, and maybe I know some. Hello. I'm in Bergen today since I'm moving houses, and this is always a bit maybe follows other rules than my own professional planning. So it's a bit improvised, my setting. I would love to have been today at my office in Berlin, but so I'm at home in Bergen, and I hope that the internet connection stays stable, and also that nothing occurs unexpectedly here in the house, things falling down, the cat coming in, or so on. And if so, I beg your pardon.
We hope for
yeah. And yeah, it's I just started in Berlin at the Biennial, and it's a bit of a change for me also in practice, because it's decidedly a bit more of a directorial role with a curator in place who really oversees the exhibition. But this comes with other challenges, tasks, and a different creative field. And I will touch upon this also in the talk now a bit. I will address a few questions specifically about the role that the city and architecture in an expanded sense has played for my practice. And I will go through a lot of examples and images, which is also helpful for me to structure the talk. And yeah, as everybody will know and understand, of course, it's always a lot of fun actually to talk about past projects and share these with an interested roundtable. Yeah, I will start the presentation now. So I studied art history and not curatorial studies, because this was at the time when I actually had my university education, not yet such a field of education as it is now. And art history provided a good framework, but I was also early on very interested in organizing and making things. That was basically my entryway into curating. And this meant being engaged in a lot of self-organized projects, initially in Stuttgart, where I was born, and then later on in Cologne, and then with a move to Berlin. This is where I'm starting now. This became also much more channeled into a specific field of inquiry or an exploration, which had to do with the time and the circumstances. It was the 1990s in Berlin, early mid 1990s, in a moment when the cityscape was after the reunification of Berlin and Germany, changing drastically. So just to give an idea, in East Germany, it was a different system of real estate development. There was also a different system actually of ownership and of how ground and real estate was structured. There was it was a decided turn away from private property, and with reunification and a Western capitalist system being reintroduced or imposed on not only society but also the cityscape, this meant a lot of drastic changes within a very short amount of time. Basically, a complete reorganization of society, and as well of the kind of spatial conditions in which society exists, from housing to the way that businesses were kept, etc. And there were I'm initially from Western Germany. I grew up in Stuttgart, but it was at that point a really interesting scenario in Berlin, and especially in the former eastern part, to see these kind of societal forces being in action, and to see and the kind of also sometimes quite bad effects. And there was another point, which was the role of art. There were a lot of available spaces in Berlin, spaces that could be taken, or where art was invited in as a changing force. It's a mechanism that is known from other contexts as gentrification, where art and culture typically plays a role to increase the level not only of prices but also class distinction. And so this was something that was happening in all its speed and brutality in East Berlin at the time. And so there was this, it felt also like a moment and a situation and a place where things have been changing, and where also like being engaged in art did actually matter and had a stake. So at that point, a lot of initiatives were set up and active. The image that I'm showing is from a group called Botschaft e.V., who squatted several places. This is they squatted places. They opened cafes, they opened studios and exhibition spaces, but they also engaged actively in this discussion on the reshaping of Berlin. This is a project called Dromomania, which looked at the role of cars in the shape of a city such as Berlin, but it also, being very close to the former government districts of Nazi Germany, it had a lot to do with the way that the East German government had reshaped the city after the end of the Second World War with a different vision, and how real estate then went in again with another vision, which in many cases was actually historically a bit nostalgic and maybe more affirming to an aesthetics and a spatial organization that was closer to a Prussian idea, the German Kaiser period, but also with some kind of shocking overlaps to Nazi aesthetics or ideals of city urban planning. Here, I wanted to show this because it is a kind of good example of this overlapping of activism, art, and self-organization in artistic practices that I was early on engaged. I was never part of Botschaft, but I was a frequent visitor. Then this is another project by a group called An Architektur, or Freies Fach at this point, an initiative by architecture students who in protest started to disassemble a prestigious building of the GDR government, which was afterwards actually taken down in reality. And then this is a show I was curatorially very actively involved in '98 already. Borstar Brandstadt, a collective project that tried to connect a lot of these discourses within the cultural field about urbanism in Berlin, a kind of critique about the recapitalization and its effects on many levels. And what was interesting there is it was a collective project. It was self-organized by a group, but in an institutional framework, and a kind of, yeah, I think early on strong statement of such a critique, and maybe like reminding today on kind of documentary aesthetics in the art as well. Then another example, very briefly, and also because it overlaps with my current job, a project that I developed together with Jesko Fetzer, a colleague and often collaborator, for the third Berlin Biennial organized by Ute Meder-Bauer. We were invited to create a documentary hub for this exhibition, talking about the changing conditions in Berlin. And we did this in a kind of mixed role of kind of artists, researchers, curators, with a couple of collaborators. But what it in practice did was to trace the changes in Berlin by using somehow indicators that are rarely mapped, such as the movement of illegal clubs in Berlin, and trying to understand the changing the changes in the urban landscape by looking at these factors, such as the locations of clubs, the development of real estate prices. This model in the front here, the pink and orange one, is about 1st of May demonstration routes by Eastern and Western unions and initiatives who typically hold the biggest 1st of May workers unions rallies in Berlin. And yeah, by the way, these routes that these routes take in Berlin, it also shows a bit how the cityscape changed. So we showed this project first at the Berlin Biennial, but also then in an exhibition in Copenhagen and the Istanbul Biennial in 2005. But what's important here to understand is that while these projects all deal with urban space, what they actually try to address is the changes in social space. And this was kind of fueled by an interest in researchers, philosophers such as Henri Lefebvre, on the one hand, talking about the production of space, but also Michel de Certeau, French philosopher, who was for us incredibly influential, talking about the use of space and how use is also a productive force. So by looking at space as a framework that kind of traces social changes, and that on the other hand is also a factor that actually produces social rules, and understanding space as this kind of dual function by documenting but also making social reality. So space became for me in my practice, and is, I think, until today, really a very concrete topic or medium in which many of my curatorial projects, also collaborations with artists, often take a point of departure. And then maybe to mention one other important project, which is maybe again somewhere else, but is also for me has something to do with a curatorial practice that really kind of goes out into various formats. It's a bookshop that I founded together with two colleagues, again, Jesko Fetzer and Katja Reichert, and which exists since 1999. And it's a bookshop, and it was also meant or created as a platform that has its own economy, is independent from the kind of the goodwill of public funding or private funding, but it's has its own economy that's built in and quite transparent. So everybody can also become part and supportive. And the bookshop is focused specifically on urban discussions in all its variety and overlaps with other disciplines such as art, but also architecture, philosophy, social sciences, etc. Design, of course. The first, we had to move at some point into a different location, but I'm showing these images just to get a sense. It really is a bookshop, but it is also again a social space. It's for us not so much about how the space is designed in its kind of physical sense. It's more about the use. It's really a place for gathering. From the beginning, it was meant also as this kind of open and inviting space, which is sometimes specifically talking about books a bit contradictory, because books are also fragile. If we go and buy a book, we actually want a fresh and crisp copy. But for us, it was more important to have this kind of social activity going on around books. And also books are typically kind of closed off objects. So for us, it was important to have a platform where books as object could be unfolded, talked about, opened up to discussion in a space where people actually meet. This is a picture from the opening party, but we have, I think until today, almost on a weekly basis, events, book presentations, but also performances, concerts, etc., all centered around these kind of questions of urban space, social space, the role of art in space, etc. Not only in the shop, also we often go to other places. On the right side is actually a mobile book table at Volksbühne, and on the left side a small dépendance we did at some point in the museum in Warsaw at the temporary location. We also did exhibitions with the bookshop, where the bookshop became more of a kind of author's voice. This was a show about publishing.
Then another field where this plays in is actually my academic research. I did university research and also teaching about the history of exhibitions, as Stephen said. And one kind of important reference point for me was the role that architecture played in exhibitions. And this is one, for me, still fascinating example. The Bauausstellungen of the first half of the 20th century, where architects built one-to-one models in exhibition spaces. On the right side, we see a pavilion by Mies van der Rohe. On the left side, a model building by Le Corbusier. But so the medium of the exhibition was seen by architects as a medium to actually popularize and make people acquainted for modernist architecture. And in an expanded sense, then, of course, also modernist architecture was not just about a formal exploration. It was also a display of a new way of life with which included also a new idea of society. Yeah. The role of architecture in exhibitions, there's also like a whole sub-chapter about the role of architects as exhibition designers. And it's very interesting to see this in connection for me, like that architecture exhibitions often talk about architecture, but there are also concrete proposals in an exhibition space about architecture. So not just talking about it in a kind of documentary sense, but also making a proposal and creating an architecture in an exhibition space that we as visitors experience, and where also the exhibition visitor becomes a protagonist in the story that an architect tells. Yeah, but my main focus actually was always like the 1960s and the struggles that emancipatory movements happening around the same time, and the involvement of architects in these kind of broader social struggles, including early feminism and anti-racist struggles. And yeah, this is an example by Archie Graham, who had a kind of techno-utopian approach and presented this frequently in exhibitions. And then this was one example that I really kind of worked a lot with, the 14th Triennale in Milano, which was very famously squatted by protesting students, and it was closed before its opening and only opened in a kind of changed form. And it became this kind of platform for an interaction and negotiation, also conflict, but also a productive platform for a negotiation between these different forces, architecture on the one hand and the protest movement of the 1968 on the other. And it produced such beautiful examples such as this rearranged display of exhibition furniture, which was then actually appropriated and taken into action to create a kind of seating situation and a kind of gathering situation. So here obviously without people, but still in the exhibition spaces. And this for me became a kind of very direct image that talks about this difference between an exhibition space as a social space and exhibition space as a space of display. And I'm definitely more interested in the question of what can be actually done in an exhibition space. How can an exhibition space be activated and fully unfold its potential as a social space? I frequently published also books. This was one publication I did with Bina Choi for Casco in Utrecht. But yeah, then another curatorial project, an exhibition that connects maybe quite directly with the first images I showed with the 1990s in Berlin. And talking about space, of course, and its relationship to art, there's often this complicated relationship that art is actually a driving force in increasing effects of gentrification, in being an active force in evicting communities out of spaces that had been available for other purposes, often to a lower price, and art comes in, galleries bring in collectors, etc. It's a problematic relationship. And I organized an exhibition at Kunstwerke KW, nowadays called Now and 10 years ago, which addressed this and our relationship to gentrification and the kind of almost nostalgic image that we often have of past conditions in spaces. And once gentrification happens, it looks commercial. It looks basically like every high street in every other city. But then there is still this memory of a situation how it used to be. And but then art often does not do much in actually addressing this while the process is happening. And Bernadette Corporation's novel Rena Spallings was published for this exhibition. And also, we try to create a kind of encounter of contemporary artistic practices at the time. On the left side is a photograph by Wolfgang Tillmans with kind of underground artists who were part of movements that actually lost a bit visibility and also spaces in the moment of gentrification in Berlin Mitte. I wanted to also talk about organizational work, because speaking about curating and doing exhibitions are often short-term events. They happen in a very kind of distinct period of time. And to me, curatorial discourse often is a bit limiting, because it doesn't look into the long-term organizational frameworks, which also has to do with basically organizational conditions, like working conditions, for example, as something like how do we actually produce exhibitions. And secondly, also how does an organization producing exhibitions, how are they situated in the middle of other communities? How are they becoming part of an urban fabric of a network of other communities? So in a way, to me, speaking about the the city as a context in a kind of more fundamental way requires for me to speak not only about exhibitions or projects, but also about organizational work. And this is maybe something I became more interested in over the time, to have a kind of platform and a working context and framework, which is much more about lasting, maybe more sustainable discussions and effects, at least as a way of addressing these. And the first, after kind of projects that took place in self-organized context, I started a position as director of Künstlerhaus in Stuttgart. And it's one of these ironic positions. It's a great building, a lot of space with a tiny budget, and even less of a kind of sustainable staff structure. So it's very few people trying to do a lot. And but it's an amazing experimental platform, and also like a thriving hub for artistic discussions, and really a kind of crucial place for a very specific artistic scene in Stuttgart. And yeah, I assembled here a couple of other architectural or city inspired projects. This was an exhibition called Social Diagrams, really looking into participation since the 1960s and 70s in architecture, and like almost technocratic models of making to invite users into a design or discussion process on the city and architecture. But then I'm trying to be a bit quicker now. Index, again, a very small organization in Sweden, Stockholm. And what's interesting about Index is that Stockholm has a very hyper capitalist and very exclusive real estate market, flats, but also shops, and basically every piece of architecture in the inner city is extremely expensive, which led to a situation that a lot of arts organizations, even arts organizations with a kind of good budget or a private supporter, are forced to move further and further outside of the city center. So the city center is just handed over to commerce and banks and other forms of well-earning businesses. With the exception of some large-scale public institutions such as Stadshuset, Kulturhuset, which is really in the city center. But otherwise, there's not much besides Index, which is in a very interesting location, 5 minutes from the main railway station, but in the middle of a housing complex, of a kind of soft modern housing complex, which was for me an incredibly interesting working situation, being almost like smuggled into this inner city context, being able to realize a challenging and interesting program there. And one of the long-lasting things we did there was to open a kind of bar in our office every Wednesday. Every Wednesday, no matter what happened besides that, running a kind of small-scale opportunistic live program, inviting artists who were in the city just traveling through, or artists who live in the city, but and we're looking for a kind of low-key presentation possibility. So it became again like a besides this kind of exhibition focus, we introduced a small scale live program focus, sometimes well visited, sometimes really just a few people, but it was a kind of discursive, low-key, almost self-organized discussion platform. And then most recent example of institutional work that I did, and there I want to talk about 2 exhibitions in a bit more detail to elaborate on that a bit, is Bergen Kunsthal. Bergen, it's an old institution founded actually in the early 19th century as a Kunstverein type private association, or a foundation. right in the middle of the city. And again, like which is for me a really crucial thing, it provides art in an urban context that's actually accessible. It's on people's mind because it is so close to the everyday routines, and people know the building just by passing by, which is just opens so many more, opens the door to so many more people than if it's difficult to actually find. So it was a great luxury to actually be able to program such an organization. Yeah, and yeah, if I say Bergen, it often sounds, people have often the impression it's very far in the north. It's actually not. Norway is much higher up there actually than here on the map. So it's rather in the south, but of course it's a bit of the kind of close network connections to the rest of continental Europe. So it was also a kind of interesting situation. It made people curious to actually come and do something because it sounded already a bit more distant to places that people usually do presentations. Yeah, and this is kind of, I'd like to actually play with this image of the kind of misty, moody countryside and the hills and so on. But yeah, this one project by Oskar Tuason, and maybe they want to come back to this idea of the exhibition space as social space. So Oskar Tuason, an artist, is addressing often architecture in his work, but we presented a project which, yeah, is called Water School. It's a kind of assembly space for discussions on water, built on in this pavilion structure, which is remodeled after an early example of solar heated house in the desert, the Somme building. And but what we did was, so this was on the one hand, these were exhibition pieces. They contained further works by Oskar Tuason, a fountain that was kind of a tree that was turned into a fountain. But we opened also up the exhibition space over the course of the exhibition towards initiatives that either had a water focus or other environmental discussions and concerns, to host them, to invite them in to hold discussions either in private, just as a group that needed a space, or actually as public events. And we see here a few examples. So as one way to actually activate the space, not just by a public program that we put together ourselves, but also as an open space that people were invited to take over and to turn the exhibition space in yeah, something else, into a discussion platform. And then happening at the same time was an exhibition by Cassandra Press. Candice Williams actually co-created with Puppies, Jade Gonaro, Goriki Olivo. Again, the space quite clearly addressed already its own functionality as a library, as a place to sit and read rather than to just look at things. Then Bergen Kunsthal is also well known for its busy live program, concerts, discussions, typically on 4 days of the week. The Kunsthal hosts live events, and not just connected to exhibition, also a lot of events just co-produced with external partners. So this is also a way to bring in different audiences, not just the typical audience of Bergen Kunsthal, also inviting communities in that are more connected to a partner organization, a club, a film festival, an artistic platform, etc. And often also with a kind of hedonistic edge. So it was also about having fun, inviting to a party. It's okay if the house goes completely crazy. Yeah, one of the exhibitions I wanted to show was a project about the ocean, also just titled The Ocean. And it was an exhibition happening in the Kunsthal, but also in several spaces in Bergen, in front of the Kunsthalle, and also in more distant locations. We really tried to invite artists to do something on this topic across the city, and to appropriate spaces, and to invite also people into this discussion. And yeah, and we also, the exhibition decidedly also included artworks, but also non-artistic materials, like these boat models from a museum collection, to show this kind of parallel life that exists in exhibitions. Maybe to speak about the ocean in Bergen, it's important to understand the role. It's really kind of, Bergen exists because there is the ocean close by. It exists because of trading relations. It was a hub for the trading of initially dried fish. The Hanse had, since the Middle Ages, a trading post in Bergen, who traded dried cod that was caught in northern Norway, in the rich fishing grounds in Sapmi territory, in what is still today indigenous territory. And they were traded it to and sold it to the rest of Europe. First fish, later on also wood, wool. There was a booming textile industry, etc. So Bergen was always a trading post. The ocean was an infrastructure for trade. And it's still very much part of the contemporary mindset of Bergen in its self-understanding. This is a mosaic of an old kind of folk figure, Himmelfatten, a person who carried fish, and who's a kind of, who became a symbolic, actually a logo figure for a pharmaceutical company operating first in the US and then in the UK. They found this image and they traded fish oil. It was interesting to see how this image of fish, the sea, and the connected industries branded Bergen, not only in Bergen, but also became these kind of globally circulating images or icons. And this is a mosaic of this figure that's now back in Bergen on one of the hospitals. But this figure, in a way, became almost a kind of starting point, a kind of core idea of this exhibition, pointing to the ocean as a really real existing infrastructure, but also as a kind of an image or an idea. Yeah, this we assembled a lot of artworks touching in different topics of ocean industries. This is a work by Peter Fendt about algae development. There were lots of works about farming, about salmon farming, about fishing industries, about trading and the ocean, but also was the kind of colonial relationships that were established through the ocean. I mentioned already the fact that the trade happening with dried fish happening in Bergen was actually exploiting indigenous territories in the north. So there was a colonial relationship within what is nowadays called Norway or Scandinavia. But there was also from Bergen, there's a kind of long-standing colonial history towards African countries, the so-called Gold Coast. And there were works that addressed this relationship also actively. And I mentioned already the non-art exhibition components. There were kind of quite directly worked with educational tools, or like an explanatory mode of some of the topics, and unpacking the complex layers of political and social relations that all overlap in our relationship to the ocean. Yeah, another outdoor artwork by Kåre Grundvåg. Yeah, this was like a project we did with the architecture school here, which was we presented the results of a half-year research project into the spatial organization, or how to explore the ocean in an architectural sense. I wanted to still show this. This was yeah, an app that we produced with an artistic group based in Bergen, young Black practitioners who made an app that told stories of very concrete episodes in the colonial relationship between Bergen that were connected through the ocean. And yeah, again, what I wanted to show with this project also is the way that it went out from the exhibition space into the city, but also explored non-exhibition formats, events. This was a concert on the lake, a listening station that one of the artists, Elinmar Øyenvista, put up on one of the mountains, which actually overlooked the harbor of Bergen, a hut that was built in a traditional Sami technology, and then invited to listen and experience the space, this kind of looking post towards the ocean, where back in the days Sami fishermen came and brought fish in. And a radio station that we hosted in this pavilion that Sol Calero designed. Radio Hopes and Dreams produced a week-long program, live broadcast from this pavilion. Then one more exhibition that I thought could be interesting to talk about, because it's an artist from Norway, Jonango, actually from a Sami artist, so based in Tromsø, in the territory that crosses actually northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and a small part of Russia, that is called Sapmi, and is a kind of transnational indigenous territory where over the last decades a lot of efforts have been made to gain bigger visibility and bigger possibilities to actually preserve and revitalize Sami heritage, and also to gain levels of political autonomy. We did this exhibition with Jonango, who by trade has been educated as an architect, but who has been doing exhibitions as an artist since many years, always working on this intersection between architecture and art. It was meant as a kind of survey exhibition of his work, but also as something that, again, like we invited him to explore our building and turn it into a different space, into something that is kind of structured by Sami knowledge and sensibilities, that talks about Sami heritage, and that also makes use of the space in a shifted sense as a social space. And one of the biggest projects we presented was an ongoing project that has recently been shown also as part of the Venice Biennial of Architecture. So not this year, but last year, 2023. It's a project called Girjegumpi, the Sami Architecture Library. And as you might imagine, Sami architecture is not really there are traditions of building, and there's also a contemporary discussion, but it has for a long time not been acknowledged as its own field of either academic research or of architectural practice. So by claiming that the project is actually a Sami architecture library, Yoanango also claimed that there is such a history that needs to be researched and that needs to be understood and gained to gain more visibility and to be acknowledged as a relevant field of research. So he looked for materials and basically gathered everything that exists in writing. And indeed, there is only a very limited amount of research, but actually through the project also more research is made. And so, of course, because it's a field of research that exists not really in academic or architectural training, or a lot of the material is also either self-made or primary research, or exists as oral histories or in other ways. So actually also some textiles have been incorporated as artifacts that actually talk about architecture in a very direct sense, but it has not been written about. But so this is understood as also a valid form of research and knowledge. And the library looked like this in Bergen. It was kind of it's a small building on a sledge. So in northern Norway, transportation really relies on snowmobiles and on things that can be carried by snowmobiles or earlier on by animals. But here in the exhibition space, this structure was kind of taken apart and presented almost like an image of a building. This is how a previous iteration of the library looked. This was presented in Sapmi. Then it talked about other forms of research. So this is, we see these tents here that are inner spaces, basically like rooms made for larger structures called lavu, like rooms for these lavus to separate more personal space within this kind of larger buildings. And they are printed with historic images that were initially made from a colonial perspective, but Yoanango incorporated them into the project and printed on these tents. And then one more example, this is a fake Sami drum we were able to borrow from the local history museum, actually the University Museum, who still holds this drum, which was claimed to be a Sami drum, but it's actually a forged artifact. It's not really made in Sapmi. It's actually faked by a former museum director. It's a wild story. But we were able to borrow this and incorporate this story also through this artifact into the exhibition. And in exchange, we gave a new fake drum that was made by Yoanango and a collaborator, a Romani coppersmith, to the museum. Making was really part of the project. The technical team of the Kunsthal was taught traditional crafts and techniques, such as this sewing of actually cleaned and emptied fish stomach that was turned into a projection screen. This is a traditional way of making a window that Yoanango found and re-explored. And then, this is another point of making that became public. Lali Gabor, a Romani coppersmith that has been a frequent collaborator of Yoa, whom we invited to work on this exhibition with us, and who set up a mobile forge actually in front of the Kunsthal in this mobile van. And these are some of the collaborations that happened in this project. Yeah, it was actually a COVID show, so we had to postpone for several months and used this time to produce a specific project, a TV show, a kind of TV show. with several episodes, which the Post-Capitalist Architecture TV, in which Joa, who was also stuck in Tromsø, drove around as a kind of flying architecture reporter to talk about the specific understanding of space and architecture in Sapmi in discussion with various practitioners. Yeah, again, the space was not only an exhibition space, but also used for many gatherings. We held a busy public program and also other forms of events in the exhibition spaces. So the library was not just a library that visitors could explore, but it was also a public meeting place for events. This is a different example of an exhibition in Tromsø, actually, where a structure by Joa, Nango, was used actually as a meeting place for political discussions for ongoing conflicts at the moment in Tromsø. Yeah, again, yeah, this was a dance company. Then one last example, maybe just to show that just happens now with the amazing artist Edgar Kalel. That show we opened last month. It's my last exhibition at the Kunsthal, in which I was actively involved. Edgar Kalel is based in Guatemala, is an indigenous artist from Cachiquel background. And in his work, he incorporates traditional knowledge and rituals that become something else in confrontation or in dialogue with local contexts that he encounters. He often works with his family, so the exhibition install happened with a larger group of collaborators that accompanied Edgar Kalel. And so I said rituals, so many of the kind of forms you see have a very concrete or specific meaning in an everyday practice for the artist in his home context, but here they become something else. They still incorporate this knowledge or meaning, but they also invite for a reflection on their meaning in this specific context in Bergen. So the hills, for example, were inspired also by the landscape around Bergen, which is actually kind of so Bergen is known to be surrounded by 7 mountains. And again, the exhibition space becomes very much a space of encounter, inquiry, actually kind of playful investigation of this very kind of huge transformation of the exhibition space. And what is interesting here is like, so it's live fire. And so basically in this exhibition, we managed to incorporate basically every single thing that is usually tried to keep outside of exhibition spaces. When we in discussion with Edgar in preparation of the exhibition, he said like, yeah, he would actually like to bring earth, and then also fire, also water. And of course, it would be great if the doors could be open so there's also wind. So and in one way, of course, there's this connection to the meaning that these elements have for him, but it's also used in this exhibition setting as a challenge towards the arts organization to handle these requests that basically fundamentally shake the norms and conventions that we have of how art should look and be presented, and how an exhibition space is supposed to work as a social space. Maybe I finish here. I have, I think, one last slide for the the Berlin Biennial. I'm back in a way at the 90s in Berlin, but maybe I leave that to questions.
Great. Thank you so much. There are a couple of questions. So the first from Iveta, if you had the opportunity to fully activate an exhibition space, as you mentioned, what kind of social environment or interaction would you aim to cultivate within it?
Yeah, I mean, it of course it really depends on the context, but like my general idea is I like to speak of the exhibition spaces that I work for as a productive mix between a museum and a community center. So for me, it's really ideally I'd like to bring diverse communities together and to create a setting where yeah, also the space can be taken over and where something can be done that we have not foreseen yet, and also that challenges the ways that we had already imagined the space.
Okay. Next, a very short question from Professor Cato. Will those artists participate in the 2025 Berlin Biennale? Those artists, maybe that means all of the artists you spoke about, or some of them, or is it early? It's kind of early in the process still, no? Or
The artists to participate in the next biennial, yes, it's actually, I mean, it's an interesting topic because we will not publish an artist list until very shortly before the exhibition happens. Yeah, it has to do with the management of expectations, also to keep the exhibition should not be defined by a list of artists. It's really about the ideas that stand behind the exhibition, and then of course also about everybody experiencing the exhibition in Berlin or in other ways. So we do not publish the artist list very much ahead of the exhibition date. But the curator is announced since a long time, Sasha Kola, curator who's currently based in Italy and now, of course, in Berlin. And we're working very closely and actively with her. Yeah, most of the artists are invited, of course, and the production process is going. But what is known, so the running time is announced. It's now I don't know it by heart, but it's mid-June. I think the 13th is the opening until the mid of September 2025. And as usual, the exhibition will take place between various locations. KW is typically the core or the starting point of the exhibition, and then there are other institutional partners, and then also some spaces which we use for the first time for an exhibition. So it's also this exploration and investigation of space that is, yeah, at the core of the biennial.
all right. Last, I think last, yes. So, an anonymous attendee. Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. I wonder if you might be willing to elaborate a bit more on the stakes of showing indigenous artists in the European context, and then in parentheses, which are surely very different from approaches and political stakes in the context of North America, where I'm writing from. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so maybe just to put it to the example with Yuanango, who's from Norwegian indigenous context, the stakes. I'm not sure if they're so different, but this has been Sami art history has been for a long time excluded and not acknowledged in what has been told as art history from Norway. There's so the kind of the colonial relationship still exists today in the way that history is written, and even looking at exhibition programs, there's still a lot of work to do in bringing Sami art artists and Sami culture, giving it more of the space that it deserves. There's, for example, still not an own museum in Sapmi focusing on Sami art history or contemporary practice. So there is a public collection though. So, but was speaking about architecture when Yonango did research on Sami architecture history. One of the kind of maybe most depressing realizations is that there are public buildings, also Sami focused public buildings on Sapmi territory, but none of them had been built by actually a Sami architect. So they were all built by either Norwegian or international architects. So it's still very much this question of like who speaks, then actually where are the spaces, not just that an artist get a prize or that artists are bought by the National Museum, but also that there are spaces that can be shaped in a way that is just handed over to indigenous artists or communities by themselves.
Okay, there is one more question from Christopher Pelham. What is the day-to-day or week-to-week nature of your collaboration with the curator, in this case, the Italian curator you just mentioned for the Berlin Biennial?
How the day-to-day collaboration is?
Yeah, how do you work together?
So that's so with Sasha Kola, who's based in Italy, but actually is born and raised in India. But our we just started working only 2 months ago, and in a way we work quite closely. We share and I mean there's different responsibilities. Mine is more kind of strategic and organizational responsibility, and the curator has the main responsibility for the show. And in case of the Berlin Biennial, there's a quite strong level of the curator has a lot of say about the exhibition. Of course, it's really the biennial exists in order to make the vision of the invited curator happen. But then there's a lot of work to do around that to actually make that possible, because it's important to situate this curatorial vision in a very concrete context, spatially, legally, but also socially and artistically. So there's I wouldn't call it mediation, but to be that kind of interface between the curatorial vision and making it happen as a reality. So I would say this is, in this case, very much my function, and it also comes with maybe a strategic perspective. For the future, I'm interested to also, work more on a kind of longer term strategy that has a lot to do with these kind of organizational values that I briefly touched upon also in the talk. But this is a quite specific case, I have to say, how we work with the curator in this biennial context, because it's also such a long-term working process on a large-scale project. Like where I worked in Bergen before, I also worked with the curatorial team. We had I worked with an exhibition curator and a live curator. And this was very much a teamwork, again, like with shared responsibilities, but it was very much like a collaboration.
Okay, so with that, thank you, Axel. Thanks everyone for joining, and we will be back next week with Katarina Gregos from Athens. And in the meantime, Axel, we'll see you shortly on the other link.
Okay.
Great.
Yes.
Thank
you.